One thing that we did want to talk about, Kyle, because we were chatting about this a little bit on our stream the other day, we noticed one of your videos got a lot of pushback in the comments. We always monitor how people's audiences and stuff are reacting to their takes. And it did look like you got a bit of pushback for this video about AOC being confronted by anti-war Tulsi fans. So I wanted to just quickly play the clip that we reacted to, not the whole clip, but just a couple minutes out of it.
We'd be here for 20 minutes, 30 minutes.
Exactly. And then I'll tell you where I slightly disagree. I think we mostly agree, honestly, but I just want to explain where I slightly disagree, and we can kind of hash out the beef. So let's play this clip real quick, and I'll break down where I kind of differ from you.
You originally voted, you ran as an outsider, yet you've been voting to start this war in Ukraine.
What?
You're voting to start a thermonuclear war with Russia and China.
That is massively overstated. Who invaded who? Who invaded who? Russia invaded Ukraine. The U.S. didn't invade Ukraine. The U.S. didn't invade Russia. Ukraine didn't invade Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. So in the wake of Russia invading Ukraine, why is it a bad thing to give them defensive weapons? Now, look, I've told you guys this. After the first 2 or 3 packages, I would have started to wrap it up a little bit. You know, at this point, we've had, over a dozen packages sent to Ukraine, and it's been somewhere between $50 billion and $80 billion worth of weapons sent to Ukraine. Yeah, I agree that's overkill. And yeah, I agree that's probably because the politicians are enriching the military-industrial complex. That's probably the thing that they care about first and foremost. So I don't deny that it's overkill, but to say that this means you want a nuclear war, what kind of bullshit is that? If the United States sent weapons to Palestinians to defend themselves against Israeli aggression, would this guy say, "Oh, you're a war hawk. You're pro-war"? My guess is no. My guess is he would understand, well, those are defensive weapons to the Palestinians. So that's very different by its nature because it is defensive.
All right. So there's the clip that we reacted to on the show and where I, just slightly disagree with you. And in principle, I do agree with you. I don't think that in principle, there's really anything wrong with arming countries who are under attack or arming countries that need help or just, providing aid in general. I think the problem comes into play with the nuclear war possibility and the fact that Putin has quite explicitly put that on the table and threatened basically Armageddon in the words of Joe Biden, our president. So the comparison that I like to make, and I'd be interested to hear your opinion on this, is when we illegally and offensively invaded Iraq, do you think it would have been a good idea for a country like Russia, for example, another nuclear armed superpower, to step in and start sending packages of weapons and aid, lethal aid, to Saddam Hussein to protect Iraq from our invasion? Because I don't think that would be a good idea. I think that would be escalating to nuclear armed superpowers into a potentially catastrophic situation. But how do you look at a situation like that or a hypothetical like that?
Yeah, so I agree with you, but I'll add the caveat that I do think it's debatable. And I was going to bring up a similar example. When we invaded Iraq, Iran decided they were going to arm Shia militias in Iraq to fight the Americans. And so even though, like you just said, I don't agree with that, but I certainly think it's a debatable issue because I wouldn't say that Iran in that situation wants World War III or wants war with America. I would say Iran wants the U.S. out of Iraq. And that's why they're doing that. By the same token, I think the U.S. wants Russia out of Ukraine. So I actually think it's perfectly analogous in that sense. Is there any part of that you disagree with?
Well, the only thing I would say is that if we started saying we're going to start a nuclear war, going back to that time period, if we started threatening nuclear war, then no, I absolutely don't think in any way, shape, or form it would have been a good idea for Iran or any other country that had nukes. Iran didn't have nukes at the time, did they?
No, they don't even have nukes now. No.
Right, because of the Iran deal, correct. Yeah. So if they did, though, I think that any two countries that both have nukes escalating pretty much in any way would be a bad idea. So if we were saying at the time, hey, we're going to start a freaking nuclear war over this, and Iran kept sending more money and escalating the situation further and further, then no, I don't think that would have been a good idea at all. in the same way that I don't think it's a good idea for us to be escalating with Russia, who's explicitly threatening nuclear war. Again, I have all the solidarity with the people of Ukraine that have been displaced and killed by this, unnecessary conflict. But I just worry that us intervening, given our track record, that it is escalating towards a nuclear war or a World War III type situation. And also in the same way you brought up, the Israel-Palestine conflict, as much solidarity as I have with the Palestinian people, if Israel was, if we started arming Hamas, for example, I also don't think that would be a good idea.
Yeah, see, that's where again I agree with you, but I think it's a nuanced conversation, because in principle, what I have a problem with the U.S. or anybody for that matter arming non-Hamas, non-extremist Palestinians for self-defense. I'd say, yeah, I mean, I think that's a debatable issue. I wouldn't be upset if somebody wanted to do that, but to your point, you'd want to add stipulations of like, none of this can go to Hamas because Hamas targets Israeli civilians, etc. So, I mean, I think we largely agree. I just think it's a very nuanced conversation. I do agree that nuclear weapons does change the analysis, and I think you'd have to be like very hard-headed not to concede that point. That yes, nuclear weapons, it raises the stakes and it makes it so you have to be more cautious. But then I do want to ask you though, because I still stand by that I would have been fine, and I was fine with the first 2 or 3 packages of weapons going to Ukraine. I would have added the caveat that they should be tracked and none of it should get into the hands of the Azov battalion and all that stuff. But by your logic saying, hey, since they're threatening nuclear war, it's like, it's a whole different calculation, which I agree with. But would you then say like we shouldn't have sent anything to them at all? Because if we didn't do that, then they would have been steamrolled. I mean, the fact that they're even still hanging in there is a testament to the fact that we have basically allowed them to continue to be a country effectively. So do you agree with me that, hey, the first 2 or 3 times, you can give 2-3 billion, whatever it is, in weapons so they have a chance to defend themselves? Or would you say, hey, since Russia has nuclear weapons, like, don't fuck with them at all, so don't give Ukraine any weapons? What would your take on that be?
Gavin a chance to answer that. But I do have one more thing that I think kind of does, kind of relate to your question, Kyle. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is how much you think, United States encroachment and NATO encroachment actually played a role in Russia's hostility towards Ukraine. So Gavin, go ahead and, I don't want to like cut you off, but I want to follow up and talk about that as well.
Yeah, we can definitely talk about that. My answer is honestly no. I don't think that the U.S. should have intervened in any way. And like, again, there's really no good answers in this conflict, but I have to take the stance that given our track record, even just in the last 20 years as a nation, as a warring nation, as an imperialist power, I don't think we have any moral authority or any moral high ground in which to be intervening in these sort of conflicts, especially with a nuclear armed superpower. If the U.S. had like a perfect track record and we ourselves had not engaged in illegal offensive invasions in the last 20 years, then maybe that would be different if we were just like a, completely neutral, good country. But that's just not the case. And again, given the massive hypocrisy of us intervening when we ourselves are guilty of the exact same thing, and probably would have, gone to war with Russia if they had tried to intervene when we did the exact same thing. I just don't think it's our place. So maybe if other countries that didn't have a similar track record as us wanted to get involved and help out, that's totally fine. But the way I see it is that there's a 100 humanitarian crises unfolding around the world right now, most of which we're enabling, most of which we're facilitating. And we just can't step in and, be the world police, unfortunately. So I do think that given my anti-interventionist perspective on this matter, no, I don't think we should have really intervened at all.
I mean, I don't think that's a crazy opinion. I think that's a fair opinion. But I would just say that then without a doubt, Ukraine today would be Russia. It wouldn't be Ukraine. Ukraine would be gone.
Right. And that kind of leads into my question with you, Kyle, because I think that, part of my, obviously this is a nuanced, question and it's so easy to come off as like, cold or like, whatever. I don't want to like come across like I'm not considering the, the turmoil and the will and the, of the, people of Ukraine. But to me, it does seem like if we're, trying to take a bird's eye view at this and look at it, as imperialist powers would, as, Putin will look at Russia and its position on the global stage and, Biden and the generals will look at the United States as in its position on the global stage. And you look at what's happened, and, you know, you have a NATO agreement that's, you know, post World War II, right? And that was initially with the Soviet Union, but it's been honored by, you know, Russia. But the agreement was that there wouldn't be any encroachment onto Russia's border, right? And the United States and NATO have completely ignored that. And you can see over time in like those progressive maps where they change the color based off of who, you know, has been brought into NATO, that they now have encroached on Russia's border, and it's got closer and closer and closer. And then you also have to think about the fact that, you know, why does the U.S. have any interest in Ukraine, right? Why are we more interested in Ukraine and their sovereignty than we are about the sovereignty of Yemen, right? Why are we not so concerned about what's going on over there that we have to send aid packages to Yemen, when instead we're just, you know, letting Biden bend it over and take it from MBS, regardless of how he treats, you know, Biden in regards to oil prices? You know, we're still supporting them. You know, so it's clear to me that it's mostly the oil, right? The natural resources that are in Ukraine. And I think that's why most of NATO's, you know, invested in this at all, to the fact that they've entertained it at all. I don't think it's so much the fact that we care if Ukraine is reduced to rubble, in the same sense that we don't really care if Yemen is reduced to rubble, or if Syria is reduced to rubble. But in this case, there's, you know, money to be made and there's oil to be had. You know, so I'm just wondering if you think that, you know, this is, again, one of our corrupt ventures that's just, you know, there to be, you know, a washing machine for corrupt money to go back into the hands of the military industrial complex, to better position the United States and to hinder Russia. And to the extent that that's been successful, I think we could debate. But I just think that there's so much more to, you know, potentially that line of thinking. Like, if you're thinking like, how does the United States think about this? Then what it boils down to is like, you know, we're doing this out of any kind of like, you know, goodness in our hearts, because it would just be so incomparable to how we've treated other invaded countries around the world.
I mean, if it's going to be a really short conversation if you want me to concede that the U.S. doesn't, you know, that the U.S. acts selfishly and like an imperialist power on the world stage, because I think that's fucking super obvious. That's the most obvious thing in the world to me. I mean, that's all there is. We arm 73% of the world's dictatorships. So this notion that we are, you know, principally involved in democracy and spreading democracy and being the world police, and that's why we do the things we do because our intentions are so good, I think that's obviously not true. I think that when talking about this particular conflict, though, the nuance that a lot of people are missing is that sometimes you could accidentally wind up on a side that is not wrong, you know? And just like I said, if the U.S. happened to arm Palestinians that are not Hamas, and it's to defend Palestine. Now, they'd never do that, but if they did do that, I would say, wow, that's certainly an interesting and debatable thing, because on the one hand, I don't want to be a massive global arms dealer, but on the other hand, if we're going to arm anybody, I'd rather it go to them than the 73% of the world's dictatorships. So to your question about NATO specifically, NATO encroachment, yes, I used to think that was, if not the only reason for Russian aggression, I thought it was maybe the predominant reason, that like the majority reason why they're doing what they're doing is because they feel existentially threatened by NATO encroachment. Now, having watched the war unfold, having seen the actions that Putin has taken, and I think more importantly, just listen to his own words in his speech when he announced the invasion, I'm now of the belief that I think he would have done this anyway, even if NATO never expanded, but I don't think NATO should have expanded in the first place, because I don't want to give him an excuse. I don't want to give him something he could point to say, well, actually, that's the reason. Because really, it's propaganda, in the same way that when the U.S. invaded Iraq, we had this whole list of reasons and grievances. It's like, oh, he has weapons of mass destruction. Oh, you know, he's really bad against the Kurds. He's a brutal dictator. Like, they kept changing the reason and moving the goalposts, and they had their narrative and their propaganda, and all of it effectively was bullshit. Because I think fundamentally what it was for was oil. You know, this is what an imperialist power does. It cares about natural resources. It cares about propping up puppet regimes that are kind to our corporate interests. But by the same token, and this is a part that I think a lot of people on the left miss, I think that's also why Vladimir Putin is doing what he's doing in Ukraine. I think he wants the oil and gas. And in fact, in 2014, when Putin took Crimea, it was only 2 years earlier, in 2012, that they found massive natural gas deposits right off the water in Crimea.
Yeah.
And so I find
it with you at all that that's 100% why he wants Ukraine.
Yeah, that's a huge reason. The other thing is he sincerely believes it's a fake state. He thinks it was a big mistake when the Soviet Union was broken up and the territory was given away. And Putin he's not a lefty. He's not, he doesn't believe in the Soviet Union. He's not like a Stalinist or anything, but he believes in the former glory of the Russian Empire. Again, this is me taking his own words from him in his speech when he announced the invasion. And so I think he wants to recreate some semblance of the Russian Empire and gain territory. So between that and wanting the oil and gas, I think that that's effectively why he did what he did.
I don't know. I saw a YouTube video that said that Putin was based and he owned the libs. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, no,
he's not defying Ukraine. Yeah,
yeah, 100%. Yeah. Anyway, I think that there's a lot of truth to that, and I guess if we could all agree on the fact that this needs to be de-escalated, right? It's not like the kind of military mission that, I mean, I think you said that in your initial video that you think you already would have stopped the aid packages and the U.S. involvement, if I remember that correctly. But what would your strategy be moving forward then? Are you pro diplomacy? Are you, obviously, there's the Chomsky route where, he's, essentially, kind of made the case that I think you were alluding to, which is, sending diplomats and trying to negotiate some sort of peaceful settlement. But I'm wondering what kind of compromises you think would be necessary for Putin to concede to a ceasefire, and do you think one exists where Ukraine still has some of its country left as its like sovereign nation? Or what are your thoughts on?
Okay. So first of all, that's a great question. In fact, I would go as far as to say that is like the question. That is the only thing that actually matters in this conversation. And that's actually why I was super annoyed by these protesters, because the main thing they were arguing for was not, hey, get a peace deal, do diplomacy, negotiate, like, let's find a way out of this. The main thing they kept asking for was stop arming Ukraine. And I do think there's a fundamental difference between, like, the first thing in the conversation needs to be peace deal. Okay, that's the first thing. So to answer your question specifically, what would I do? And I did a whole thing on this on Crystal Kyle and Friends. Basically, I think the peace deal that I would propose, and I would basically tell Ukraine behind the scenes, like, it's a wink and a nod, like, if you don't accept this, your weapons are cut off. Like, basically, you have no choice but to accept this. Effectively, that's what I tell Ukraine. Now, whether or not Putin accepts it is a totally different question, because I don't really think he's a partner for peace. But I would propose to Putin, all right, so everybody talks about we need a face-saving thing for him so he can get out and feel like, oh yeah, I did good, I pat myself on the back or whatever the fuck. I think that's true. For basic human psychology reasons, he needs to feel like, oh, I actually did gain something, right? And so that would be Crimea. So Crimea is even though it's been gone since 2014, it's been in Russian hands since 2014. It's still technically part of Ukraine. It's like illegally occupied territory according to international law, but what I would be willing to concede is just acknowledging reality, because it's been like this for 8 years already. We're willing to say Crimea is officially Russian. Okay, so that's the first part. The second part is I'm not going to just give Vladimir Putin Eastern Ukraine and say, this is now yours because you invaded it and declared it's yours or whatever the fuck. Because what I think that does is incentivizes in the future, any big country can invade any smaller country and say, I demand this. And then the country could say no. And it's like, well, will you at least give me 20% of it? And it's like, sure, fine. And that's a bad precedent to set. I don't want that precedent set. So, but what I would say is there is a dispute. There is like a raging war there. And what I would do is say that we can have this it's an independent country, what was Eastern Ukraine. It can become an independent country, and you put UN peacekeepers in there to effectively try to keep the peace. Now, outside of that, yes, the only assurance Russia gets is Ukraine is no longer going to be, it's not going to be in consideration for NATO. Ukraine is it's not going to be in NATO. Okay. So now, again, Putin says that's like one of the main reasons why he did what he did, but Ukraine was never in NATO and he still invaded anyway. So again, I'm skeptical that this is really the reason why he's doing what he's doing, but I'd put that peace deal on the table. So Crimea becomes Russian, Eastern Ukraine effectively becomes an independent country with UN peacekeepers, no NATO for Ukraine. You put that on the table, and then that's that. Now, again, since the US basically effectively can control Ukraine because we've given them all the aid, all the money, all the weapons. Without us, they're just dead in the water effectively. So, Biden would have to tell Zelensky, like, look, we're done with the fighting. We're risking nuclear war here. This has gotten way out of hand. So this is what's on the table. Effectively, like, you're going to have to take this deal. Now, I feel really bad for Ukrainians in that situation, because it's like, you're telling them like, hey, you're going to lose this part of your country and that part of your country. And it feels fucked up. And it also kind of sets a bad precedent. But the thing is, every other option, I think, is a worse option, because yes, nuclear war is in the conversation now. And so you have to find a way to avoid nuclear war without at the same time laying a terrible precedent of like might makes right, and any big country could just take over any smaller country. So that's the deal that I would put on the table. But I will say this, given that deal, I do fear something. And these are critics who are, arguably to my right on foreign policy. They would make this counter argument to me. They'd say, well, how do you know? Okay, so let's say Vladimir Putin goes, yeah, sure, I agree to this deal, signs the deal. And then within a year or two, he invades Moldova, or he invades some other country, former Soviet bloc country. And, at that point, people turn around and say, well, Kyle and anybody who proposed a peace deal, you're fucking Neville Chamberlain, and you tried appeasement and it didn't work because the guy was unappeasable. Because that is exactly what happened with Neville Chamberlain and Hitler. It's like he got a peace deal, said, okay, we'll give you fucking Sudetenland or Rhineland or whatever the fuck it was. And Hitler was like, yeah, sure, this is all I'll take here. Let's make peace. I won't do anything bad from now on. And then he just kept going. He kept invading shit. Now, is that a possibility with Putin? Absolutely, I think it is. I think it's a possibility. And so in that situation, I'd look like an asshole, and I'd look like an appeaser, and I'd look like Neville Chamberlain, and I'd look like a dumbass. But you know what? I'm willing to accept that if that were to happen, because the fact of the matter is, if he does end up continuing after an attempt at a peace deal, well, then nuclear war really is on the table. And at least I gave us an extra 2 years or 3 years of being able to live a normal life before we got to that point. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Anyway, that's my answer to that. I know it's a long answer, but that's kind of why I was annoyed with these protesters, because they're not lefties, they're LaRouche'ites. That's the first point. The second point is, I think they were straw manning. I think they were straw manning the people they disagree with. I mean, it's one thing to criticize AOC for continuing to vote for more arms to Ukraine, but to say because of that she wants World War III and she wants thermonuclear war, I don't agree with that. You can criticize somebody while being honest about what their position is. No, I don't think AOC wants World War III. And then again, they put the cart before the horse, where they're like, their main thing was stop arming Ukraine, not get a peace deal. So if you just want to call for stop arming Ukraine without getting a peace deal, we should be clear that what they're calling for is, I'm pro-Russian imperialism. I want Ukraine to be gone, and I want Russia to have the country. So anyway, that was my criticism of them. Go ahead.
Well, I totally agree about the protesters. Yeah, they were super cringy and bringing up, why aren't you more like Tulsi Gabbard or whatever? Like, it completely discredited their argument, because she's far more pro-war than AOC, and is literally out here stumping for candidates who want to go even further in Ukraine. She's stumping for Don Bolduc, who thinks that Joe Biden's not going far enough. He said on Fox News that we should literally basically have boots on the ground in Ukraine. So that's total insanity, complete hypocrisy that totally discredits those jackasses. Although I will say that you kind of say, like, if we're not arming them, then we support Russia imperialism, and I don't agree with that either.
Well, no, if you don't want a peace, if you're not calling for a peace deal, if you're saying just don't arm them, but you're not saying that, you're saying don't arm them, but also let's get a peace deal. That's a totally different position. They're just saying stop arming them. They didn't call for a peace deal. They said just stop arming them. That's a totally different thing to say, because if you say just stop arming them and nothing else, don't negotiate, don't do diplomacy, don't actually get a deal, what you're saying is cut off the weapons and let Ukraine immediately get taken over by Russia. So I think what their claim is fundamentally different than the claim you're making. You're saying peace deal and don't arm them. That's different.
Right.
That's different from just don't arm them.
Wanted a peace deal at all? You just think
no? They would have said, if they wanted it, they could have said it. They could have said, "Hey, AOC, my main criticism of you is why are you not prodding Biden to sit down at the table with Putin?" They didn't say that. They said you need to be more like Tulsi Gabbard and stop arming Ukraine. Yeah. So that's just, to be honest, they're saying, I want Russia to take over Ukraine. That is a different position than the position you're espousing. And this is what I'm trying to get through to lefties, is like that they're not lefties. Like, they're just not. They're actually pro-authoritarian Russia.
Yeah. No, that's a good point, and we basically acknowledge that. And I also agree with you that yes, we have to make a peace deal, even if there is a possibility that Putin doesn't abide by it, and like you said, 2 years down the road, maybe he decides to invade Moldova or something like that. Yes, that's a possibility, and obviously we have to reckon with that. But I just don't see what the alternative is other than making a peace deal, because I mean, I don't think the conflict is worth World War III. I really don't. Like, unfortunately, again, with all the solidarity in the world to Ukrainian people that have been affected negatively by this conflict, I just don't think it's worth sacrificing like the whole entire human civilization over a regional border dispute. Especially since we've done the same thing in the last 20 years. Like, I also don't think it would have been worth starting World War III over our invasion of Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria or whatever. There's no real good answers here, but unfortunately, I just think it's in the best interest of like the entire global community that this conflict remains as regional as possible and doesn't spiral out of control into this massive global free-for-all.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of people who are just being flat out dishonest when they pretend like nuclear war is not on the table now. It's not in question now. Who was it? It was like Leon Panetta or some other high-ranking defense official who admitted that, yeah, I put it at about a 25% chance that there's a nuclear war now. Bitch, 25% chance. Have you ever played poker? A 25% chance is going to hit a decent amount. It's going to hit 25% of the fucking time. That's way too high for nuclear fucking war. Are we really talking about this right now? So you have to, there's no way around it. You have to try to get a peace deal. You have to try to give peace a chance. Hey, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but at least I bought us another 2 years, 3 years, whatever, of not having fucking nuclear annihilation.
Yeah, just to follow up on that really quickly, Kyle, say that, Putin did break that agreement. Would your response to be like, then you're full bore on nuclear war, or do you continue to, just to clarify, because I mean, obviously not nuclear war, but then would you be more interested in seeing the United States have a military response? Because I think that might be where we start to really fork in the road. I feel like personally, I don't think any of these world leaders can be trusted, right? And obviously, I think that Putin would very well likely break a peace agreement. I think the United States has broken basically every agreement we've ever had with another country. So why wouldn't Putin break agreement that he made with a smaller country like Ukraine? But then I'm just curious, where do we go from here? And I don't want to, make this the only topic we chat about, but I just worry about that, right? Because I feel like then there is going to be that overwhelming response of the people that, you were talking about, the people who wanted us to go full bore against Ukraine from jump and send American troops there and help liberate Ukraine. They're all going to be saying, see, we fucking told you so. This man can't be reasoned with. And then they're going to bring out all the crazies that are like, oh, we should assassinate Vladimir Putin. And like, I heard that on like a conservative clip the other day. So I just mean, like, these kinds of ideas are going to start to get floated by more and more credible people if there is a peace set or a negotiation and it falls apart. So I'm just wondering, what's your backup plan?
My answer is it depends on how far he goes and what he does. Like, the devil is in all of the details. So, if, let's say, for argument's sake, he takes over Ukraine, eventually gets all of it, right? Then what? Then if he goes for Moldova, if he goes for, all the former Soviet bloc countries, like, when does he stop is the question. And is there a scenario where, he doesn't stop until it's 7-8 countries, or would he even stop then? Would he threaten the rest of Europe? I mean, these are the legitimate questions that people are concerned about. Now, I happen to believe that while what he's doing right now is horrendous and terrible, and it's on him, functionally, I think he would only go as far as whatever the former Russian Empire borders were, the former Soviet Union borders were, which, by the way, I don't even know what's the number. What is it, like 10 more countries? Like, it's a lot of fucking countries, right, to rebuild that. So that would be a massive invasion. I don't know if he has the, the military might and the tactical ability to be able to really pull that off, and even the economic means to really pull it off over the long run. But like, that's as far as I think he'd go. But yeah, I mean, it depends on what he does. But I will say this. It would, in a sense, prove my position wrong, right? If he kept going afterwards, because it's like, yeah, well, why'd you even, basically what they would say is this: why'd you even bother with some bullshit fake ass peace deal when he was going to do this anyway? We were right all along. Basically, the only way to defeat something like that, somebody like that who doesn't stop, who's unappeasable, is eventually they have to be defeated. Now, what does that defeat look like? I don't know, because like you said, nukes are in question now, so it's a totally different world. The fact of the matter is, realistically speaking, whoever has nukes, whatever countries have nukes, they can almost do whatever they want, right? Like, there's a lot of fucking leeway when you have nukes. Are we
We kind of
comfortable?
invented that tactic too.
We did. I mean, we fucking were the only ones who used it. We nuked Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think that was a tremendous war crime. There's a great video by Sean Jen, I think, on YouTube about, you know, the U.S. nuking Japan and how it totally wasn't merited, and it's incredibly detailed. But anyway, the question you're asking is a super important question, and I don't have a good answer other than to say it depends on specifically what he does. And that's really all I got for you. I wish I had a better answer, but imagine for a second you're president of the United States and you're facing this exact scenario. I don't fucking envy this at all. I mean, if you're Joe Biden, half zombie, half dead Joe Biden, and you got to deal with this, it's like, what the fuck do you do? Now, the funny thing is, he's actually been a lot more. He'll get criticism from both sides on this for obvious reasons, but he said no when everybody and their mother in mainstream media and Democratic inner circles and Republican circles was telling him, do a no-fly zone. Do a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Shoot down the Russian planes. He was like, no, I'm not going to fucking do that. He also said no to their longest range missiles being sent to Ukraine. He's like, no, I'm not going to do that. He also said no. Eventually, for a while, it was on the table that Ukraine is going to get fighter jets given to them by the United States. And Biden vetoed it. He said, no, I'm not going to give fighter jets to them because he viewed that as an escalation. So currently what Biden is trying to do, and you could argue he's not doing this well and he's far overreached or whatever, and I probably agree with that criticism, by the way, but what he's trying to do is go tit for tat, and whatever Putin does, just sort of match it and say, look, you're not allowed to do this. I'm going to try to show you you're not allowed to do this, but I'm also want to make clear I'm not trying to escalate with you type shit. And that's why when Putin keeps threatening the use of nukes, I think it's actually important that people point out, like, that motherfucker is the problem. You know what I'm saying? Like, he's the problem. I have a million criticisms of U.S. foreign policy, and you guys know that better than anybody. I think the criticism I get the most from every quarter is that I'm too non-interventionist, right? But it is, I think in this instance, it's undeniable that he's the fucking problem. And that was another reason why I was pissed at those people who were protesting, is that they act like Russia has no agency and Putin has no agency. And it's like, why don't you put the lion's share of the blame where it belongs? You can attack the U.S. for not going down the road of diplomacy and negotiation, but for the love of God, who invaded who? Who did it? And if you go listen to Russian leftists, they're the most clear on this. They're the most clear on this. I know who the fucking problem is.
Yeah, you're not going to find any disagreement from us there. And sorry, Zach, you can follow up. But I was just going to say that, I totally agree. There's no denying that Putin is the aggressor. Anyone pretending otherwise is deluding themselves. We all totally agree on that. It's just how do you respond to that situation, I think, where maybe there's a slight disagreement.
Yeah, for sure. And you asked me...
Well, what do you guys think of my peace deal? Let me ask that. What do you think of my peace deal? Is it too lenient? Is it too hard? Is it the right balance? What do you think?
Personally, and I don't know, like, I'm not a fucking, expert on foreign policy. I only really started digging. I mean, I knew about the Crimean annexation, but I think a lot of us really started digging into the, Russian-Ukraine affairs recently when the invasion happened. But to me, it does seem like maybe Putin won't accept that offer that you're posing. I think that, to be honest, the dude's going to, I think that, this has been co-opted by like the worst of the worst unsavory people. But I apologize in advance for, the fact that this comes straight from, a real swamp. But I think that unfortunately, there's not going to be a way out of it that I see. And again, I'm down to play poker with Putin, right? And say, we don't give away the bag immediately, right? You never give away more than you have to, right? But right now, I think to follow your poker analogy, like, we've seen the flop, right? This guy was willing to invade Ukraine. He went for it, right? So we still have some options to go. We're still waiting it out. It's not over. But I think that he's got a good enough hand that you're not going to be able to shove him off the board easy. You're going to have to play it out. And I think he's going to keep Eastern Ukraine. I don't see a situation where he goes back to Russia after all of this. And he diplomatically concedes without Eastern Ukraine, which has been the entire bedrock of their propaganda machine, which is what I think is hard about it, is they have leaned hard into the one thing. And to the extent that this is, being receptive by the Russian people is widely disputed. As you mentioned, Russian leftists, are adamantly opposed to the war. And there have been a lot of reports of people who don't want to fight in Russia and are actively protesting despite all kinds of, laws that are being put in place to criminalize it and all that jazz. But I think the problem is that any kind of support that Putin does have in, Russia, Moscow, whatever you want to say, is kind of hinging on the propaganda machine that they've built, which is that we are on a denazification effort, right? You'll see a lot of fucking crazies in America parrot this exact same line, but this is essentially what Putin puts out. We're leading a denazification effort through Ukraine. We are leading this country back to its former glories. We are no longer going to be a backseat country. Russia is going to be a powerhouse of the world again. To me, it seems like going back and saying, oh, guys, hey, now under international law, we've got Crimea. That seems like a fat L to Putin. And I just don't see him going there unless he had like absolutely no outs. And unfortunately, Russia has nukes. So he always has some out. I feel like you have to really give a dog a bone on this one. And again, it sounds so like out of touch and, who the fuck am I to be saying any of this? But if you want my analysis, right, I just don't think that, with all solidarity to the people of Eastern Ukraine and like the Donetsk region and all of that, I think that maybe the best situation that you could find is that you try and do your best to get a United Nations controlled election in those places. And,
that's the Elon Musk plan. That was the Elon Musk plan.
That's why, yeah, and I don't agree with Elon Musk entirely, right? But I do think that you're going to have to do something like that if you're going to win over Putin. I think that short of just saying, okay, we respect your election, and anybody that tells you the elections that Russia did in those areas is like an authentic, legitimate leftist election, is like fucking crazy pills, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, they're 99%, like that's like a North Korean election. That's like the kind of elections that get done. You know what I'm saying? But I just think short of just saying, okay, you can have it, like, I don't know if Crimea is going to be enough, especially with all the lengths that he's gone and the fact that he's already said, I'm going to fucking do this. I have invaded the country. You know what I mean? Like, why would he have invaded?
Yeah, but he also invaded Kyiv. Remember, he also tried to invade Kyiv. He went into the western portion of the country, and everybody was like, whoa, I didn't see that shit coming. Everybody thought he was just going to do the eastern portion of the country. So anyway, but Zach, you think
the argument that he won't settle for just Crimea?
It depends, right? Because look, and I had this conversation with Crystal, like, it depends what he values. Is it possible that right now Russia is in such a dire situation that he's looking for any way out? That's possible. When you have 300,000 people you just conscripted and people don't want to fucking go, and there's like people shooting up the recruitment centers and shit, and you have a contraction in the economy, which, wasn't a huge contraction. It was like 3% or 6% or something. So you have all these problems that are building up, maybe dissent around him, which he senses building up. If he's in a situation where he feels like, fuck, like I want a way out of this, then he'll take it, right? But it's also possible that he doesn't care about the economy downturn, the civilians revolting, his inner circle, like starting to question him. If he values the 100-year view of like, I gained territory for Russia, and I'm going down in the history books as like bringing us back to our former glory. So the answer is nobody really has an answer to that question because nobody can really get inside of Putin's mind. But I take your point. So your point effectively is like, you also have to give away something in Eastern Ukraine in order to get some semblance of peace. So let me ask Gavin. Gavin, what do you think of the peace deal? Do you agree with Zach that maybe Eastern Ukraine has to be on the table, or at least portions of it? Or what do you think?
Well, I mean, again, we're going to have to negotiate and try to find a diplomatic solution. If that's what the diplomatic solution ends up being, that Putin needs some of Eastern Ukraine in order to be appeased and to stop this, invasion, then unfortunately, yeah, I do think that is what's going to have to happen. And I actually compared this on the show recently to a situation like, say you're getting mugged on the street, right? Say some, criminal comes up to you with a gun and says, hey, give me your wallet. Like, unfortunately, the best thing to do in that situation, the safest thing to do in that situation is to give them your wallet. Like, fighting back is actually the less safe option in some instances. And yeah, you could say, well, you're appeasing him and that's, letting the criminal win. And yeah, that is unfortunately true. But still, sometimes you got to hand over your wallet to the crazy person with the gun in your face.
Yeah, but then they have to go to prison, right? Like that's the addendum to that. Like, yeah, give the wallet away, but then eventually find that motherfucker and lock him up. Like, that's how it should go, right?
Hopefully, but if he has a nuke and he's threatening to, annihilate the entire world.
Okay, but then we have to acknowledge then that the new standard in the world is if you have nukes, you can do whatever the fuck you want. And that's what we criticize when America does it. I'm just saying we should also criticize it when Russia does it.
I mean, I'll criticize it all day long. I think it's 100% worthy of criticism. But in the same way that, like I said, I don't think it would have been a good idea for Russia or China to intervene and try to stop our dirty foreign policy. I just don't see how it's a good idea for us to try to intervene and stop Russia's dirty foreign policy when we're guilty of the exact same thing.
See, but my view is the exact opposite, which is like all the war criminals should be in prison. Dick Cheney should be in prison. George W. Bush should be in prison. Donald Trump should be in prison. Vladimir Putin should be in prison. So I don't want to set up this standard where it's like actually international law it's not real. It's totally fake. And if you have nukes, might make try. You do whatever the fuck you want. I'm trying to avoid that scenario. The question is, how do you avoid it? Because you're right that you are risking nuclear war by saying, hey, you can't do that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you don't say that, it's like you can do whatever you want and we'll just let you do it.
I mean, I totally agree that I would love to see all of those people in prison 100%. I just don't see how that's possible. And I also don't think that like NATO is a good neutral arbiter of these sort of conflicts. I mean,
well,
NATO
I agree with
led
that.
the intervention in Libya. Like it's not like it's not like
never would have expanded NATO in the first place. I never would have expanded NATO in the first place.
I'm not saying that you hold that position. I'm just saying a lot of people say, well, like NATO has to hold Putin responsible or NATO has to stop this. It's like they're both bad. Like they're both bad. NATO is also responsible for atrocities. NATO is also responsible for invasions. Like I just don't see how Putin's going to end up in jail, so to speak. Like
the only way out is a peace deal, and you just have to hope it sticks. That's literally the only way out. And then outside of that, then the debate is, what are the specifics of the peace deal? Is it something like Zach laid out, which is like, yeah, Crimea, but then also Eastern Ukraine or portions of Eastern Ukraine? Or can you get away with, relying on the fact that maybe Putin is desperate right now to find a way out? The only face-saving thing is Crimea, and the rest, like I said, independent territory. Yeah. But the other thing is, I really do get the sense, and there was a poll on this, actually. Crystal just sent it to me. It's true that it's an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians are like, fuck you, give us back every inch of land. And on the one hand, I sympathize with that, right? If you're Ukrainian, you're like, yeah, this is my fucking land. But then on the other hand, it's like, well, then we are rolling the dice with nuclear war. You know what I'm saying? So it's just, there's no good answers. And I
totally sympathize with them as well. I totally sympathize with them. And like I said, there's really no good answer, unfortunately. And maybe if nukes weren't involved at all, I would have a totally different outlook on the situation. But I just think the involvement of nukes and the fact that we're risking the annihilation of so many more people in the long term, I just don't really know what the correct answer is in that situation. Again, given the fact that Putin is clearly capable of using nuclear weapons. I mean, most people didn't think he would invade Ukraine in the first place. He did. Clearly, This is an unhinged person that's willing to do, unorthodox tactics and embrace, extremely dangerous measures in order to get what he wants. And I just don't know what the good idea, or I just don't know what the right solution to that is, because I don't think there's any way to just go take him out, without starting a nuclear war.
No, that's psycho talk. That's Lindsey Graham psycho talk. No way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll hear people like Vosh, for example, say well, we have to because he's threatening nuclear war, he's such a belligerent that we need to go deal with that, and the way out of the situation is not to appease it, but to just destroy the possibility of that ever happening by, I guess, regime changing Russia. But I just don't see how that would even be possible. I just don't see how that's a possibility without it just literally spiraling into World War III super quick. And also, if it does, World War III breaks out, I don't necessarily think America's in the best position, because Russia and China are going to get together, and
Iran,
and Iran. I don't know if we're going to win that war.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, which is why the position of literally any peace deal, any talk of diplomacy and negotiation equals appeasement, and it's a hard no. I find that position beyond infuriating, because it's like, okay, but then you have to acknowledge you are getting us closer to nuclear war, and it might end up in nuclear war if we take the approach that you're espousing. And usually those people don't acknowledge that. They'll act like, no, actually what we're doing is we're the ones who are making us safer by saying no peace deal ever. And it's like, I don't see how that's the case. I think that makes it, obviously right now, the stakes keep rising. Look, if that theory was correct, we would already be in a situation where it's safer, right? Because they won from the beginning. The people of look, arm more, get more involved, draw the hard lines, say not an inch of land, no negotiation. That is what has happened since the invasion. And where are we now? Again, if you believe our defense officials, 25% chance nuclear war. That's fucking crazy. So obviously that's not the answer. You have to try to give peace a chance. And again, if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. Everybody can make fun of me. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't do it, the other options are what? It ends in more escalation in nuclear war, or Ukraine and Russia get bogged down in a conventional war for another what? 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 10 years, and then you have a death toll in the hundreds of thousands. Is that okay? Are people just okay with that? No,
Right.
That's nobody should be okay with that. Yeah.
Right. I mean, of course not. I'm not okay with that either. But in the same way, like going back to the Israel-Palestine conflict, like if and again, let's ignore the fact that we are arming one side of that conflict. We're arming the aggressor in that conflict. We're facilitating that conflict. Yeah.
Exactly.
But even if you remove that from the situation, if the Israeli government was saying, hey, we're going to start a nuclear war over this if you intervene, then no, I don't think it would be the correct or the ethical position to get involved and start arming the Palestinians, even though they're clearly the ones that are being invaded in the same way that Ukraine's sovereignty is being chipped away at. The Palestinian borders are slowly but surely being chipped away at. And that's horrible. It's not okay. It's not. But if the Israeli government was saying we're going to start a nuclear war over this if you get involved, I also think that it would be in the interest of harm reduction, essentially, to say, yeah, like as much as that sucks, it's not worth sacrificing the entire human fucking civilization over.
I think arming the Palestinians is debatable. I think originally arming the Ukrainians was debatable, but obviously not now that we're fucking $70-80 billion deep in it, right? So those things are debatable, but the part that I don't think is debatable is that you have to do negotiation and diplomacy and get some sort of a deal. And that goes for Russia and Ukraine, and that goes for Israel and Palestine.
Agreed.
Right? Like that's the main position of the left should be negotiation, diplomacy, find some sort of deal. The downside of a deal is nobody's really going to be happy. You're going to have people who are like barely okay with a deal, right? But if you can get a barely okay shit on both sides of it, then, we're everting potential apocalypse. So you have to do it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty inarguable. And I think that anyone that argues against that is just straight up silly. Like, I don't understand how anyone could argue against that, honestly.
I agree. I agree, yeah.
Yeah. So, like I said, I don't think we really have too much disagreement on here, maybe just a little around the margins. And if anything, I think the main criticism of someone like AOC is that she's not, she's not being a more vocal advocate for such a deal. Like she should be out here.
Correct. I agree.
Bernie Sanders and the squad and saying like, hey, like, what are we doing here, guys? Like, what is the end game here? How long is this going to go on? We can't just get involved in this like years long quagmire with a, regional border conflict on the other side of the world with a country that's not even technically our ally, funneling billions and billions of dollars into this conflict, enriching the defense contractors and legitimizing our status as the world police in the process. Like, I just don't think that's acceptable either.
If the protesters had said what you just said, I would have done a video agreeing with them. I would have said they're 100% right. And by the way, don't feel bad because Crystal also disagreed with me a little bit on this. And what we were able to break down is that it's basically macro picture versus micro picture. She was looking at the macro picture and she was basically like, look, anybody who's saying back away from the brink, no matter how they're doing it, I agree with them and they should do that. That was her position on it. My position on it was that's the macro level picture. My position was a little bit more micro level, and my fucking like undiagnosed autism probably kicked in. And what I didn't like is that I think they're straw manning her position when they casually say like, you want thermonuclear war in World War III. It's like, fuck you. No, she doesn't. Shut the fuck up. Like, you don't have to straw man her to make an argument against her. So I was annoyed with that fucking detail. And the other detail I was annoyed with was, again, they led with stop arming Ukraine, not negotiation, diplomacy to get a peace deal. And I feel like the nuance there matters. Obviously, Crystal thought more like, no, as long as they're saying anything that gets us away from the brink, it's okay. So I understand the disagreement. I get where she's coming from. I get where you guys are coming from. I just think when you look at the micro picture, the details matter to me, at least. And they sort of annoy me when it's not, when it's sort of like a bullshit way they're going about it. And then, of course, the other thing was the Tulsi thing pissed me off. And the fucking fact that they're LaRouchites pissed me off. I mean, they were at an event within the next week where, the
climate denial.
Yeah, it was a Stop Green Fascism event. Like, what the fuck are we talking about?
That shit is insane because I don't know if you've read all of the like website and the promotions for that. This is how anybody that promotes that, guys, like it fucking deranged. Like, and not only that, they think you are dumber than fucking shit because you listen to them anyway. But talking about how like climate change is just an excuse for like the Great Reset and all kinds of like deranged dog shit conspiracy theories. Gavin and I were having a really good laugh fucking breaking it down one day on the show. It was like absolutely incredible. And then you've got guys like Hax and Jinkle that just like fucking go out of the way to like promote themselves there. It's just like it's completely deranged.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
it's goofball
totally crazy.
shit. It's not a serious political project, and the specifics of what they were calling for and protesting, I think were off, which is why I took issue with it. But, you know, like I said, I get people who disagree. Fact of the matter is, we do agree if fundamentally your main thing is get a peace deal and get it now.
Yeah.
And we could argue about the specifics, but get a peace deal, get it now is where I'm at.
And yeah, and like I said, I think it's ridiculous that anyone would in any way argue with that. Like, come on, we have to be realistic.
There are plenty,
here.
man. There are plenty of people who would argue. In fact, we might be the minority position right now. That's possible. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I feel like those people think they live in like a fucking Lord of the Rings movie or something where like, you know, good has to triumph over evil. I'm like, bro, this is not that like simple. Like this is not just black and white. Unfortunately, I wish it was. And also nukes are involved. So, you know, come on.